Acha. First, we'll start with the critical life of Galileo. Now, the critical analysis of life of Galileo, the scene 14 in the play specifically depicts the dismal fate of those individuals who attempt to challenge the established status quo in the light of their own rational thinking and radical thoughts. The scene explores the vivid changes between Galileo and his visitor from the past, who strives to excite him, to such an extent that we see the old Galileo back. It's an ardent conversation that follows as they discuss the secret manuscript Discoursi, Discoursi. This is the secret manuscript. We see that Galileo, lurking from the dark shadows of his present dreary life, who was full of energy with his revolutionary ideas of logic and science. Here, the audience feels relieved and contented that their old Galileo is now back. The present version of him that was passive and subdued ceased to satisfy the expectations from him. A man of his time who has guts to challenge not only the revered ideas of Aristotle, but also the sacred doctrine of the church. It was difficult in those days to challenge the church. Regarding astronomy, was no walk in the park, a very romantic walk in the park. It was a difficult thing to do. Challenge the church. It had its dire implication and impending destiny. But there is more what made Galileo completely lose hope from his own people, despite being a faithful son of the church. Galileo had staunch belief that the church would never abandon him. However, his confidence came crashing down his feet when the church chose its own egotistical standing. See, this sort of politics is everywhere. Whichever place in the world you go, this politics will prevail. From the trial to a threatening punishment of burning in flames if he doesn't recant, this scene explodes the Galileo who suffered several repercussions. Of course, church forced on him of his mistakes of speaking the truth and his attempt to revitalize human thinking regarding the working of the universe. By witnessing the miserable fate of the great man of his time, audience may cry their heart out. However, Brecht had more in store for the audience. The latter part of the scene explores that Galileo, who is his old self again, and here the playwright makes the audience optimistic way the fact, in the light of determination and the idea that there is scope of human improvement, no authority can make the rational individual diminish his fiery desire of propagating change. The exchanges between Galileo and his daughter Virginia, remember the name, depicts a submissive and cowed Galileo. Galileo is afraid of the church, but not Virginia. Virginia is seen contented that the father has at last chosen a life for recluse, to be staying alone. She has joined hands with the monk, who sits as a guard outside Galileo dwelling, and both control his visitors. This is the effect. This is the first betrayal Galileo receives, and a dire punishment for speaking truth from his immediate family. These exchanges are short and impassive, and here we feel pitied for a man who had suffered just because he chose truth, truth above everything else. At present, Galileo has forsaken his greatness and have descended into the dark shadows of his. He has chosen a life of seclusion in order to escape punishment and a dire fate of a heresy. Heresy means going against the church. against the God, belief of God. For such a great man, this approach is antithesis to the esteemed ideals and principles, and that is exactly what Brecht serves to preach the audience. No one knows, even Virginia, who hangs on Galileo like a sleuth. Sleuth means a detective, that beyond the apparent picture there is more than meets the eye. Questioning the church authority gave Galileo two options, with the sinister imagery of flames and burning that dominates the play, and this scene in particular, execution, which is so severe and cruel that it becomes an eye opener for those who dare to question the church. The second option is more than death. Why? Because it could only offer alone exactly what Galileo chose, which made his followers and audience shriek and disbelief. Andrea anguish, and we thought you had deserted, is totally relatable because he looks to Galileo with so much respect that his move to escape punishment was totally opposed to his greatness. However, the dramatic irony is prevalent. In this scene, where Andrea visits an esteemed teacher, the scene takes a U turn from Galileo's passive writing that were in line with the church's demands to the ardent depiction of the secret manuscript. By bringing such a contrast, Beck puts forth the claim that true believers of knowledge and truth would never recreate on the sidelines and will continue to challenge the proposed authority, no matter what the consequences of these acts would be. Galileo's radical thinking and hypotheses undermined the century old traditions and ideals that were revered and held sacred. People have blindly accepted them because the source was the church. The church had such an unprecedented influence upon people that it had curbed their ability to think beyond what was presented to them. Galileo was an ordinary man with intellect and logic. He seemed not to be satisfied with the church, even though he was a staunch follower of it. By making Galileo life an example, Brecht reiterates the idea that in the fact of logic and rationality, outdated ideas has no validity because it has no validity. Outdated ideas doesn't have any validity, no, because there is always a room for human advancement, discovery that has no bounds. When Galileo's faltering situation Brecht makes the audience see that church's imprisonment had broken him physically and emotionally, by renouncing his views, he lost his comradeship with his fellows and lost his enthusiasm in work. His harsh life seems to impair his eyesight, and it was emotionally difficult to work under the threat of execution and surveillance. That was what was the church during the time. If it did not favor the church would execute him, burn him or her as a heretic. If church wanted Galileo's life as an example to those who challenge the authority of the church, the belief of the church, Brecht has a different lesson for audience. There is no doubt that Galileo's suffering was poignant and audience feel remorseful. However, with Galileo's exchanges with the students, we see his underlying zeal amidst the physical impairment as he asks Andrea to steal his manuscript to the foreign country by stuffing it in his coat. Galileo's discoveries were revolutionary and grand, but his manner of articulating them was simplistic. He used wooden objects and applies to teach his servant son, Andrea, the real depiction of the universe. Even the apple symbolism is present in this scene, as Galileo asks Virginia to cook geese with apple. For Galileo's apple reminds him of his method of teaching and his flourishing phase of life when he was cherishing people's lives with a revitalized and logical thinking. This is want made the playwright place Galileo on a pedestal. According to him, this is the true greatness, and this greatness is further emphasized in this scene. by opting for a life that is even more painful and imminent than death. Galileo lived not only to escape severe execution, but lived to make a difference in people's thinking. Even in the darkest nights when he worked and wrote his discoveries, the no motive was solely to bring about change and revitalize people's mindset. And here's dialogue. They give you pen and paper to keep you quiet. It's full of irony. His secret manuscript spoke more than his mouth could articulate alone. As his revolutionary ideas found their long awaited escape by getting stuffed in Andrea's coat and sneaked to foreign country, church pen and paper could hardly keep him quiet. Brecht invites the audience to live like Galileo, even when the lives are at their darkest phase. A determined individual like Galileo would make use of whatever appears before him to satisfy his quest of change and knowledge. Galileo's submission did not mean his renouncement from his work, rather, he created for himself such conditions that helped him further his work. Thus, by this scene, Brecht demonstrates before the audience the fact that church attempt to make Galileo represented life as an eye-opener for others failed terribly, and Galileo's utter determination was at odds with the life of total abandonment repressive institution like church sought to teach. Brecht shows the audience that Galileo, when challenging the church's teaching, was not oppressed himself. With his radical ideas propagated through science and logic, his religious views also got challenged. This situation was very much traumatic given that he was a staunch Catholic, but for the sake of betterment of his people, he was ready to compromise the religious views with open mindedness. Church was still conservative and was deeply rooted in traditional thinking that it was not ready to compromise on whatever the logic is presented to them. Church were very strict about getting out of their logic, their way of thinking. That was the only problem. Such flexibility was not permitted by the church that controlled the minds of the people and made them understand what they thought the people were wrong at. Actually, church dominated the people very much and never allowed them to speak that what is true. This is what is the problem with Galileo's life that we really come across. And we really feel sad for Galileo that he spoke the truth. He has not spoken anything wrong. He said the right thing. But the question of saying something right always does not go in the right way. To Galileo also the same thing had happened. He wanted to speak the right way of science, but the problem was that no one is ready to accept him. But the question is that how we are trying to solve this part of the answer. How does Galileo parallel Brecht's lifetimes? Brecht had written very much after Galileo's condition and being condemned by the church. Bertolt Brecht's life and his play Galileo complement each other perfectly. While one is an interesting study of a remarkable life and the concept of sacrifice, the other raises the very vital question of scientific responsibility. So, in my eyes, Brecht is an enigma since he was at the same time a lover of the good life, an ardent communist, an atheist whose favorite book was the Bible. And so, through Galileo, we can know more about Brecht through the dramatization of Galileo's life and also examine questions about sacrifice and the suppression of the disruptive knowledge. Now, there are other things also to be kept in mind. Brecht youth, when he spent in the Great War, is to be understood. Brecht's youth during the Great War is interesting because you see, during this Great War, what was becoming very, very problem is the problematic situation with the church, the direct clash with the church. Church, Brecht youth conflicts with the church. At that time, we have studied what is nihilism and communism was greatly attached to all sorts of ideology. Those who did not have faith in the church, they are not liked. Nihilism must have seemed particularly attractive during those bland and weary times. Somehow or the other, something must have happened that prevented the nihilists working according to their choice. So you see, what we find over here is what has happened with Brett. Now, many of us get confused when we read about Brett. Nihilism must have seemed particularly attractive during those bland and weary times, reminiscent of nihilism's own dreary and cynical belief. Communism, however, seemed to be Brecht's natural ideology since it reflected his atheist tendencies and his disgust with the established order. But this action is quite queer for a man who hardly demonstrated any ascetic tendencies himself. He was like his Galileo lover of good life. He enjoyed many women in his life and portrayed Galileo as someone who was equally attracted to comforts and good food. It is curious then that Brecht could embrace an ideology that ran quite contrary to his own lifestyle. See, ideology and that what we call is religion of the church cannot run together. Second major enigma is found in Brecht's devotion to martyrdom. Why he would embrace the concept of dying for a cause with such fervor is an enigma. Certainly, the story of Jesus did have a powerful impact upon Brecht, an influence that directly translated Brecht, and an influence that directly translated into so many of his early plays. You are reading one page, but I read some more than that. And wherever I read, there was some conflict with Brecht. See, if you go against an order, you'll have to enter into a conflict. If you have faith in the ruler and the rule and the institution that rules, then you are said to be the best person on earth. Such thing also happened with Brecht. For no reason whatsoever, he was held responsible about his principles, but his fascination for Jesus' sacrifice hardly accounts for the regret he felt at not having martyred himself at the hands of Nazis. It could be said that the major influence upon him was the death of his close friend Chartiakov and that of his several Soviet intellectuals. This would certainly have plagued him much, since several Russians had confessed and willingly died for the good of the party, something that Brecht would have conceivably admired. This sacrifice of the Russians echoes the communist principles that every individual must carry out actions for the greater good. Perhaps it was this parallelism that resonated in his heart and plagued him for the rest of his life. As we all know, scientists never listen to what the church says or the religion says that believes in the corollary of facts. Similarities between Galileo and Brecht were startling. Both individuals were from the educated middle class, the liking for the better things in life, and eventually adopted ideas contrary to the belief of the bourgeois. They did not eventually flee martyrdom and regretted it. That if they are martyred, they would turn into martyrdom. If church ends their life, they would be martyred. So it is clear that Brecht intends to deliver a message about his own self through his play and ultimately about the responsibility of the scientist. Galileo represents the quintessential revolutionary of the time. He knew that whatever he was trying to do will never be accepted. It's very natural. No one would accept him. He may be a communist by heart, but he has faith in God. He has faith in the crucifixion of Christ. He understands that religion is in no way directly or indirectly associated with the church. The church represents establishment. It is the social structure upon which the entire European society is based. It permeates every sphere of being, as is as crucial for order within society as it is responsible for oppression and philosophical stagnation. The question asked in the play is whether Galileo should proceed to fight the church and liberate the people, or should he stay low for the sake of order and harmony in society. In Act 9 of Galileo, we witness a possible scenario that might have arisen if the church led social order had collapsed. Society, society could itself have tumbled in the terrible fires of anarchy, fueled by the absence of moral and spiritual authority of any kind. It is to this dilemma that we can find different answers to in the play. And our obvious opinion is that it is better to live to quietly further the movement than to die for momentary accolades. Not only does this make sense, but it also raises the point of very futility of martyrdom. What does martyrdom really achieve? My answer to that would be martyrdom is a symbol. If I am martyred in the name of religion, people will say that he died as a martyr for the sake of religion and for the sake of the country. So it represents a member of the weaker side putting up a brave resistance till then so that his comrades are inspired to work harder for the movement. But the amount of life that is lost in the martyrdom may be a very important life is then taken to be too difficult. So Nazi Germany and surrendered himself. If Brecht had not fled Nazi Germany and surrendered himself to a grueling storm or even death in the blazing infernos of a hellish Treblinka, he would have achieved little except for the sense of accomplishment brought about by the realization of his dreary held ideal of martyrdom. Similarly, Galileo's death would have provoked an uprising from some radical elements of society, which could have indeed led to several changes in the favor of the establishment of a new system in which the bourgeois walked hand in hand with the peasantry to create a fairer system, not mired with negative elements like the intellectual corruption of the church. But the further works on the astronomy did much to further science, and it could be argued that the truth proceeds even today. How many of us understand astronomy the world beyond the limits of our existence. How many of us know about black hole? Very few people. But it is factual, and it is very factual because it narrates to the reality that we face in our day-to-day life experience. Black hole is a theory that is established. Similarly, Brecht is trying to establish a theory that he thinks is right, but the church is not ready to accept it. If the church is not ready to accept it, then he has to leave the theory for himself and forget about it, because this theory, even if it makes him successful, will never give him the honor, because it goes against the church. Theory goes against the church. Against the church, if you write anything, the theory will not honor you, because you're writing something against the church. The same thing happened to Galileo, who going into the astronomy of action of the world around him. He couldn't make the church believe really that he was trying to establish the fact of the world beyond our reach, very far away from this world. It is very difficult to decide whether it is Galileo's duty as a scientist to bring out the truth, whatever be the consequences, or whether to act in the best interest of society and repress the information so no major upheavals are caused. Galileo is in the beginning of a communist hero. He discovers new knowledge that threatens to break down the exploitative social order and to ignite a revolution. But here too we find the contradiction ripe in the play. Since Galileo performed several acts, including the incident involving the telescope, the Fermi, even here it could be argued that he did what was practical and that he did not bother about lofty principles. In any case, he did fulfill the communist ideal in many ways. Later on, he refused to die for the cause and thereby killed the chances for revolution. He now went against communist principles. But what about scientific principles? Did he violate them too by not bringing out the truth to the masses? The answer to that is extremely quickly. We know for a fact that when knowledge is eventually dispersed to the people, but then these very slow changes could have set off progress by decades. Also, what would happen if every scientific discovery were allowed to be stifled in the same manner? There would be utter stagnation and intellectual penury. Actually, because science is so advanced today, even strong scientific belief that would have made man insignificant has become significant today. Today, we believe in the black hole theory. We believe in the theory of the astronomy beyond the universe that extends to infinity. Why? Because it was Galileo's great effort to make us understand, knowing fully well that his life was at stake. If he had to make an understanding with the church, he had to do it in good earnest. All scientists are not ready to accept the dictates of the church. We have seen here that Galileo and thus Brecht, who's writing about him, were extremely complex individuals. There is a parallel story because what is applicable to communism, sacrifice, and Brecht is also valid for Galileo and the quest for truth. In a sense, the play is a damning condemnation of communism, for it shows how it is very naive belief in the nobility of the average man can have disastrous consequences. Galileo must have realized this inherent imperfection in human nature and would have surely contemplated how his Bible defying discoveries could only help chaos descended on an orderly society. He thus recanted for the greater good of these people. The play itself reveals much about the motivations and opinions of Brecht himself. It can be seen as an examination by Brecht of guilt and torment he feels. He sees himself in the same light as Galileo, that they were both guilty of capitulations, and he seems to conclude that ultimately it was the right thing to do, something which is practically possible, viable, which has got its own way of representation, has to be accepted. You just cannot deny it because you cannot just deny it because science only believes it but not religion. No, Galileo did not think of that. He thought of coming up with this theory of science. So he is so very famous for us. And it is for this reason that we accept him as a man of science who has brought